A tunnel sits under the sea near the coast of France, 37 meters below the waves, and until 1985, no human being had gone near it since the last ice age ended. Nobody built a wall to hide it. The ocean itself sealed the entrance shut, and it stayed that way for thousands of years, waiting for someone reckless enough to swim into a black hole in the rock without knowing what was on the other side. That someone was not a scientist with a research grant or a university behind him. He was just a diver with a flashlight and a habit of following his curiosity a little too far. His name was Henri Cosquer, and in 1985, he was diving off the coast near Cap Morjou, close to Marseille, in an area he already knew from years spent underwater. At around 37 meters down, roughly 121 feet, something in the rock face caught his eye. It was not obviously important. It was just a gap, a narrow opening that most divers would have swum right past without a second look. Cosquer did not swim past it. He turned toward it and pushed inside. What he found was a tight, flooded passage running back into the rock for about 175 meters, close to 574 feet, climbing slowly upward the whole way, wrapped in total darkness. He had no idea where it led, or if it led anywhere at all. He just kept going. For years after that first dive, Cosquer kept returning to the tunnel on his own, pushing a little further each time, mapping it out dive by dive with nobody watching, and nobody there to help if something went wrong. On one of those solo dives, his light failed while he was deep inside the passage. He had to find his way back out through pitch-black water with no way to judge how far he had left to swim. He later said the experience frightened him badly enough to make him question how much further he should keep exploring alone. But he did keep going, one dive at a time, chasing nothing more than his own curiosity in a place where almost nobody else on Earth was in a position to check his work or come looking for him if he vanished. By 1990, Cosquer decided the passage had become too long and too dangerous to keep exploring by himself, so he recruited two Belgian cave divers, brothers Bernard and Mark van Espen, to help push the guideline further into the tunnel. Following his directions, the brothers moved carefully to avoid stirring up the fine silt covering the tunnel floor because disturbing that sediment could turn the already dark water completely blind. Eventually, they reached an underground lake with a pocket of trapped air above its surface, a strong hint that dry space existed somewhere beyond it. Their guideline ran out before they could confirm anything more, so they turned back without knowing exactly what was waiting past the lake. The mystery of the dry chambers stayed unsolved for almost another year. In June of 1991, Mark van Espen went back to finish the job, laying the final stretch of line needed to safely reach whatever sat beyond the flooded section. That dive was brief and only reached the first chamber, but it proved the dry space was real and that it could be reached without dying to find out. A few weeks later, Cosquer made the trip that would change everything. On July 9th, 1991, he returned with his niece, Sandrine Cosquer, along with two friends, Jan Goguen and Pascal Auriol. This time, the group pushed further into the dry chambers than anyone had gone before, and they got their first real look at a space that had been sealed off from the outside world since the end of the last ice age. When Cosquer first noticed markings on the walls, his gut reaction was not excitement. His first thought was that someone had snuck down and spray-painted graffiti on the rock, because the idea of genuine prehistoric art sitting inside a cave that nobody could reach without scuba gear felt almost too strange to be real. It took a while for him and the others to accept that what they were staring at was not modern vandalism at all, but something that had sat untouched in that chamber for tens of thousands of years. That should have been the high point of the story. Instead, tragedy hit within weeks, and it was that tragedy, not the discovery itself, that finally forced the cave into public view. In September of 1991, word of the discovery had already started spreading quietly through the local diving community. 3 divers from Grenoble decided to explore the same underwater passage on their own. They got lost inside the tunnel and died before they could find their way back out. Cosquer and Jan Goguen took part in recovering the bodies, a grim job that made it impossible to keep the discovery private any longer. 2 days later, on September 3rd, 1991, Cosquer formally reported the cave to France's Maritime Affairs Department in Marseille. That report set off a chain reaction, and the discovery was quickly handed over to the Regional Archaeological Service under the Ministry of Culture. What had spent 6 years as one man's private obsession was now, almost overnight, a matter for the French state to investigate and verify. A discovery tied to a tragedy like that needed careful, serious verification. But finding someone qualified turned into its own strange problem because confirming the paintings were genuine required an expert who could physically examine them, and almost no archaeologist who specialized in this period of prehistory was also a skilled enough diver to swim 37 meters down through a narrow tunnel. Authorities eventually turned to Jean Corton, an archaeologist whose expertise actually leaned toward a later period simply because he was one of the only qualified researchers physically capable of making the dive. From September 18th to the 20th, 1991, An expedition led by Corton, joined by cave art specialist Jean Klotz, traveled out on a research boat to examine the site directly. Klotz was not even a diver at that point. He had first seen the cave through Cosquer's photographs while working at the Ministry of Culture, found them fascinating enough to learn scuba diving at 69 years old just so he could study the site in person, and went on to make dozens of trips out despite rough seas and bad weather regularly forcing him to cancel planned dives. Corton confirmed the site as genuine in 1991, verifying that the paintings and engravings were truly ancient rather than some elaborate fake staged inside a nearly impossible-to-reach cave. That confirmation immediately raised an obvious question. If this cave really held authentic Ice Age paintings, how did an ancient art gallery end up sitting at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea in the first place? It also did not silence every skeptic right away. France already has more decorated Ice Age caves than any other country on the planet, but every single one found before Cosquer sat west of the Rhone River. Nobody had ever found anything like this east of the Rhone in Provence, and that geographic surprise alone made several prehistorians question whether the paintings could really be authentic. The doubts grew louder once specific details reached newspapers. Critics pointed to what looked like a penguin painted on the wall, an animal nobody expected in French Ice Age art, hand images missing fingers, and the strange coincidence that the lower edge of several painted horses lined up almost perfectly with the cave's current waterline. Some of this played out in a Spanish newspaper where writers openly questioned whether the site might be a forgery. Spanish prehistorian Antonio Beltran pushed back, pointing out that other genuinely rare animals, like snow hares, had already turned up in verified prehistoric paintings elsewhere. One strange-looking animal was not enough on its own to throw out an entire site. The doubts did not last. Once excavation and conservation work got fully underway in 1992 and 1994, with Jean Klotz and a growing circle of other specialists involved, the physical evidence piling up steadily closed the door on the forgery theory for good. That same evidence finally answered the bigger question hanging over the whole discovery. The question of how a cave sitting deep underwater today ever held open-air paintings in the first place. During the last Ice Age, this stretch of coastline looked nothing like it does now. Sea level sat as much as 100 to 120 meters lower than today because huge amounts of the planet's water were locked up inside glaciers and ice sheets. Back then, the cave sat roughly 6 kilometers inland overlooking an open, steppe-like landscape rather than any ocean at all. Around 10,000 years ago, during the warming period known as the Holocene, glaciers began melting fast and sea levels rose across the entire globe. The Mediterranean coastline crept steadily inward over thousands of years until it swallowed the valley in front of the cave completely, then kept climbing until it drowned the entrance itself, cutting off dry access to the cave by roughly 9,000 years ago. Nobody hid this cave on purpose. The planet slowly drowned it, sealing it behind a wall of seawater instead of collapsed stone. That kind of watery seal is almost impossible to fake, but proving the actual age of the paintings still needed hard, testable science. When early estimates were announced, some researchers pushed back, arguing the numbers sounded too old to accept without direct proof. Radiocarbon dating on material. This ancient is difficult but not impossible, and researchers eventually built a strong case using several independent lines of evidence. The clearest physical proof came from thin layers of calcite, a mineral that slowly builds up on rock surfaces, which had formed directly on top of several paintings. That kind of mineral coating cannot form in a matter of decades, so any painting sitting underneath a layer of calcite had to be genuinely old. In 1998, researchers strengthened the case further using fragments of wood and pollen recovered from the site. Eventually, Jean Klotz and Jean Cortin collected 27 separate radiocarbon dates, and the results clustered into 2 distinct groups, one centered around 27,000 years ago and another around 19,000 years ago. That two-phase pattern meant this cave was not decorated during a single visit by a single group of people. Later, research expanded that picture even further. Between 1992 and 2012, researchers ran around 60 separate radiocarbon tests across 41 different samples taken from the cave, confirming a long span of human visits stretching from roughly 33,000 years ago down to about 19,000 years ago, made up of 2 mostly separate phases of occupation. That timeline places the cave's earliest visitors around the same period as the final people, to use the famous Chauvet Cave further north, while its last visitors overlapped with the era of the artists working at Lascaux. The 2 phases also line up with 2 different prehistoric cultures. Archaeologists credit the earlier visits, and most of the cave's hand stencils, to the Gravettian culture, active across Europe roughly 27,000 years ago. The later visits belong to the Solutrean culture, active around 19,000 years ago, a culture known elsewhere in Europe for a genuine leap forward in tool making, including fitting stone blades onto wooden handles carved from pine and birch. That same Solutrean period across Europe is also when the famous carved Venus figurines start showing up at other sites, which means the artists who returned to paint over Cosquer's older Gravettian handprints were working with noticeably more advanced tools than the people who had stood at those same walls 8,000 years earlier. That raises a much bigger question about who these visitors actually were, and why so much of what they painted does not match anything else found in French cave art. Most famous Ice Age caves in France, including Lascaux and Chauvet, are covered in horses, bison, mammoths, and other land animals that roam the open plains and forests of Ice Age Europe. Cosquer's walls tell a completely different story. Alongside horses, ibex, chamois, and an extinct giant deer called the Megaloceros, the cave contains dozens of images of seals, along with birds that most visitors describe as penguins. In total, the cave holds roughly 500 individual paintings and engravings representing 11 different species, including a cave lion and a saiga antelope, both animals that have since disappeared entirely from the Mediterranean region, along with around 200 separate geometric signs scattered across the walls. Those birds almost certainly were not true penguins, since penguins have never existed anywhere in the northern hemisphere. Researchers studying the images believe the artists were actually painting the great auk, a large flightless seabird that once thrived across the North Atlantic and looked remarkably similar to a small penguin, with a black and white body built for swimming rather than flying. The great auk went extinct in the 1800s, hunted out of existence long after these paintings were made, which makes Cosquer one of the only places on Earth where you can still see one preserved in ochre and charcoal. The cave also holds markings some researchers believe show jellyfish or octopuses, adding even more marine life to a gallery that, by every other example from this era, should have stayed firmly on dry land. That heavy focus on sea creatures actually makes sense once you remember the cave originally sat near the Ice Age coastline, but the strangest and most argued over images inside Cosquer are not animals at all. Deep inside the cave, past the point where the flooded tunnel finally opens into dry ground, the ceiling suddenly rises to a full 30 meters in the final chamber, a space large enough that early explorers needed real time just to take in its scale. Along one stretch of wall sits what researchers now call the Panel of Horses, a dense cluster of imagery containing 63 individual horse drawings, making it one of the largest single collections of horse figures found in any decorated cave in France. That panel sits near the cave's engraved crosses, simple geometric marks cut directly into the stone rather than painted, and their exact purpose remains just as unclear as most of the cave's other signs. Whether these crosses worked as counting marks, territorial signals, or as something tied to belief systems now completely lost to history is not something the physical evidence alone can settle. Painted walls only tell part of the story, though, because the floor of the cave held on to its own quiet evidence of the people who once stood there. Thanks to the cave's near-total isolation, archaeologists have recovered charcoal remains from old fires and torches, along with a small number of flint tools scattered across the ground. One particularly striking find is a calcite plaque measuring about 21.7 centimeters long, which researchers believe was used as a lamp, likely holding burning fat or oil to light the way through chambers that would otherwise have sat in complete darkness. These floor deposits matter just as much as the wall art itself, because burned material like torch charcoal can be radiocarbon dated directly, giving researchers an independent way to check the timeline drawn from the paintings above. A lamp, a handful of tools, and the remains of old fires paint a quiet picture of real people moving carefully through unfamiliar dark passages, doing exactly what anyone exploring a cave without electric light would need to do, just to see where they were going. That same pattern of careful, repeated visits is exactly what makes the cave's most debated feature, its many handprints so hard to fully explain. Among the earliest artwork inside the cave sit dozens of hand stencils, made by pressing a hand flat against the rock and blowing pigment around it to leave a ghostly outline behind. Estimates of the total number vary depending on the source, with official French heritage records citing 55 negative hand stencils, alongside extensive finger markings, while other researchers have counted closer to 65 individual stencils across the cave, made in both red and black pigment. A striking number of them appear to be missing one or more fingers. Thumbs are almost always shown fully intact, while the other fingers are the ones that disappear. The same strange pattern shows up at other caves too, and researchers now recognize it as a recurring feature tied to the Gravettian culture that produced art across large parts of Europe during this period. At Gargas in the French Pyrenees, over 100 of more than 200 recorded hand stencils are missing digits. At Maltravieso in Spain, the majority of hand images show the same pattern. Some researchers argue the fingers were simply bent down out of view, similar to how you might fold fingers to make a shadow puppet. Others point to frostbite, since the pattern of missing fingers, sparing the thumb while shortening the rest, closely matches how frostbite damages hands in extreme cold. A related theory suggests the missing fingers formed a deliberate signaling system, an early kind of sign language, though this remains speculative. A smaller number of researchers argue for deliberate ritual mutilation, though other specialists consider that unlikely, since losing fingers on purpose would have been a serious survival risk for people who depended on their hands for hunting and toolmaking. Nobody has settled which explanation is correct, and that uncertainty makes these hands one of the most argued over details in all of Paleolithic art. They are not the only unusual human trace left behind on these walls either. Cave art from this period almost never shows recognizable human figures. Painters from this era overwhelmingly chose animals, geometric signs, and hand stencils, leaving full human bodies almost completely out of the picture across nearly every major site in Europe. Cosquer breaks that pattern with two unusual engravings. One shows a figure that combines the lower body of a seal with the upper body of a man. The other, even stranger, shows a human figure that appears to have been struck by a spear or similar weapon, described by researchers who studied it as an image resembling a killed or wounded man. Nobody knows what story either image was meant to tell. It could show a hunting accident, a symbolic warning, a ritual scene, or something tied to belief systems that left no other written or spoken record behind for anyone to recover. What is certain is that both images are exceptionally rare subjects for this entire era of art, and their presence inside Cosquer adds yet another layer to a cave that keeps breaking the standard pattern of what Ice Age painters usually chose to create. As remarkable as the surviving artwork is, a huge portion of what once decorated this cave is already gone for good, and the reason ties directly back to the same rising sea that hid the entrance in the first place. Because sea levels rose gradually rather than all at once, the lowest sections of the cave were the first to disappear underwater, and a significant share of whatever artwork once covered those lower walls has been lost completely, dissolved or worn away by seawater long before Henri Cosquer ever arrived. What survives today sits mostly in the upper chambers, the sections that stayed above the rising waterline, long enough to remain at least partially preserved, even as the entrance itself sank below the surface. Research attention on the cave actually slowed down for several years after 1994, once the far more accessible Chauvet Cave was discovered in the Ardèche region, and pulled funding and scientific interest away from the difficult, expensive work of underwater fieldwork. It took until 2011 for the alarm to be raised again in earnest, when researchers Michel Olive and Luc Van Rel documented rapidly worsening damage to several images caused by accelerating sea level rise, a warning that pushed the cave's preservation back to the top of the research priority list. Continued erosion, shifting currents, and rising modern sea levels all add pressure on what remains, meaning the surviving artwork exists on borrowed time in a way that dry inland caves like Lascaux and Chauvet simply do not have to worry about. More recent studies have gone further, tracking how ocean water actually moves through the cave's karst system and even finding traces of microplastic pollution reaching the same walls that have survived 30,000 years of natural change, adding a distinctly modern threat to an ancient site. Given how fragile the surviving art really is, protecting it from further damage, including damage caused by careless visitors, became just as urgent as studying it in the first place. Part of that protection effort involved keeping certain details about the cave's structure completely out of public view for decades. In March of 1992, researchers discovered a second entrance into the cave system, separate from the original underwater passage Cosquer had followed years earlier. Rather than announcing this discovery publicly, authorities chose to keep its location secret, a decision that held for more than 30 years, driven by fear that publicizing a second way in could make an already fragile site far harder to secure and protect. That kind of long-term secrecy shows just how seriously French authorities have treated the site's vulnerability, especially given how easily uncontrolled visits could damage artwork that had already survived tens of thousands of years underwater. Diving into the real Cosquer Cave today is not allowed for the public, and access is restricted to a small number of qualified researchers working under tight scientific supervision. French authorities, led by figures such as scientific director Cyril Montoya, continue running structured research campaigns to study the cave without speeding up its decay. Henri Cosquer himself later pursued a legal dispute with the Ministry of Culture, seeking compensation under a French law passed in 2001 that entitles the original discoverers of archaeological sites to a financial reward tied to the site's historical value. To let the public experience the site without risking the original artwork, a detailed, full-scale replica called Cosquer Méditerranée opened in Marseille on June 4, 2022. Visitors enter through simulated exploration pods designed to recreate the feeling of surfacing from underwater into the cave's dry chambers, before walking through a recreated version of the paintings and engravings, including a full reconstruction of the panel of horses. Researchers also built a complete digital scan of the cave's surviving upper sections, described by one geologist as a preserved memory of a place the sea will eventually reclaim entirely. the genuine cave, stays sealed behind seawater and strict access limits, exactly as it has remained since long before Henry Cosquer's flashlight first cut through that darkness. Even with all of this careful research completed, a long list of basic questions about the cave remains stubbornly unanswered. Nobody can say for certain why marine animals appear so prominently on these walls when almost no other Ice Age cave art anywhere in Europe focuses this heavily on sea creatures. Nobody knows why some visitors chose to leave hand stencils with fingers folded or missing, or what that gesture actually meant to the people who made it. Nobody has explained why two separate groups of people, separated by roughly 8,000 years and working with noticeably different toolkits, both chose this same, hard-to-reach cave to create their art, or whether the second group even knew anything about the images the first group had left behind in the dark. Every detail in this story traces back to verified radiocarbon dating, calcite layer analysis, and decades of extremely difficult underwater field work carried out by trained divers and archaeologists working together under genuinely dangerous conditions. What started as one diver following a strange gap in an underwater rock face turned into one of the only Ice Age art sites on Earth built around seals, extinct seabirds, and a wounded man, rather than the horses and mammoths found almost everywhere else. A rising sea that could have destroyed this cave completely, instead sealed part of it in place for thousands of years, preserving a version of Ice Age life that looks nothing like what scientists expected to find. All because one recreational diver decided to follow a hollow in the rock instead of swimming past it.